The population conversation is fascinating to me because if you look into it for about 3 seconds, you instantly get, like, you can be shown one graph and you suddenly like get everything, right? Our population, in particularly in Western countries, but not just in Western countries, is just way below replacement. And, you know, Francis was we were having lunch and he was talking about the fact that teachers are getting fired from schools now because there's not enough kids.
And
Restructuring.
Yeah, particularly in central London, there's loads of schools closing down.
So you've got that going on, and yet whenever I see any politician who's like, maybe like Miriam Cates says, you know, whatever you think about the rest of her politics or whatever, she just says, we need to talk about babies. And suddenly, like, the swarm of rage descends upon them. The same with, look, I don't know much about Viktor Orban. I read bad things about him in the papers. Okay, let's assume that they're all true. But still, like, why is this such a controversial subject to say we're not having enough children and maybe we should think about ways of encouraging people to reproduce the society in which they live?
Why do people think it's inherently fascist? Yeah. I mean, it's worth saying that basically every country cares about this up until 5 minutes ago.
Right.
There used to be this line in Australia encouraging people to have more children, that it was you have one for mum, one for dad, and one for Australia, encouraging people to have 3 kids. So it's definitely not, I mean, it's also the case that like Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia and so on encourages high fertility. That doesn't mean that
Amongst certain groups.
Yes, that doesn't mean that natalism is unique to authoritarian regimes by any means. It's basically a normal position for governments up until very recently. And I mean, because not least, like the geopolitical implications are just so blindingly obvious.
Yes.
Like if your country has a shrinking population, you don't have enough young men to form an army. Obviously, you're incredibly vulnerable. I mean, this just seems it's like 101 stuff. And yet, yes, I mean, I love Miriam, but yeah, she stands up and talks about natalism and people on the left lose their minds.
Well, why is that, Louise? Why is because natalism is like a clever word that like intellectual use, but like the idea that people in a country ought to replenish the population by having children.
Yeah, the families are good, the babies are good.
Yeah, like why is this coded? Like we have this, by the way, this is another thing that pisses me off, which is like we have this term now, something is coded as right-wing, which basically means it's not right-wing, it's just a bunch of dickheads in the media think that you shouldn't talk about this issue.
It gives right-wing vibes.
Right.
Yeah.
Which, like, so why is this coded as right-wing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really fascinating question. Like, why would the most affluent people and comfortable people who have ever lived in the history of the world decide that actually having babies is bad and is onerous and is, I mean, because what you'll hear so often, right, and there's like a little bit of truth to it, but I think it really misses the mark, is that people can't afford to have children, which means, like, translates as people can't afford to maintain the lifestyle associated with having 2 incomes and no kids when they have kids, which is absolutely true. And it's also the case that obviously house prices in many urban centres are incredibly high and there is downward mobility. Like the baby boomers were pretty much the peak in terms of affluence and comfort. That's true. But it's also kind of crazy because it's literally the opposite trend globally. The poorest countries have the most kids, the richest countries have the fewest kids. And actually that is the single best predictor of people having children is crossing the certain threshold in terms of GDP per capita. It's somewhere like $5,000 to $10,000 per person per year, which is not very much, right? Like countries that are below replacement now include countries like Nepal, like Sri Lanka, like much of the Middle East, much of South America. You know, we're not talking just the rich countries. This is now increasingly a global phenomenon. And yeah, I mean, so the big mystery, and I'm not sure if I have, it's sort of, I think you reach the point where you can't just think of it in materialist or economic terms. You have to start thinking in almost spiritual terms. Like people in rich countries have just lost the will to reproduce themselves and to reproduce their cultures. And in fact, often think that doing so is a bad thing. They think that there's something suspect about their cultures, about their genetic line, whatever. Like there's this, it's obviously not everyone by any means, but there is a kind of elite faction that has this incredible like drive to suicide almost, like cultural suicide. And yeah, I mean, it's quite hard to explain that without thinking of it in spiritual terms. I mean, I'm the thing I'm driven to think, which isn't a very happy thought, is that maybe, you know, I think when I last came on the show, we talked about why the progress model of history is really silly, right? To think that everything gets better all the time. A model of history which is obviously simplifies, but which probably has a lot more truth to it than the progress model, is a civilizational cycles model. So the idea that civilizations rise, they peak, they fall, and that a common feature of civilizations at their decline phase is this complete loss of confidence. And this complete, I mean, you in the final centuries of Rome, you will read people complaining about how the elites have all stopped having kids. Like that, there was a tax brought in on childless men to try and encourage elite childless men to reproduce. You know, they had exactly the same phenomenon. And the Romans, of course, were using more primitive forms of contraception and abortion and obviously used infanticide. So they had different means of controlling their fertility, but it was the same phenomenon and people were saying the same things. And there does just seem to be a point where a civilization, reaches this like spiritual malaise. And maybe we're just there. I know it's not a very happy answer, but I think that's from doing all my research on this subject, I can't really help but reach that conclusion.